So welcome to our celebration of Swami Vivekananda's birthday. Hoping we're going to get a bigger audience soon. Just a minute, we're going to adjust it. We'll commence with some Vedic chanting by the Sri Sarada Nuns. That'll be followed by a panel of two of us exploring the theme Swami Vivekananda's groundbreaking ideas. So I'll be joined by Dr. Shanker Karunanithi for that. And then following that, there'll be a talk by Pravrajika Gayatriprana on Swami Vivekananda, the Eminent Yogi. So welcome to those who have already joined us via Zoom, by the way. Now request the nuns to come up and do some Vedic chanting.
We'll be chanting the Narayana Sukta. Om Sahana Vavatu Sahanau Bhunaktu Sahaviryam Karavavahai Tejasvinavadhitamastu Mam Vidvishavahai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. May Brahman protect us both. May he nourish us both together. May we both work together with great energy. May our study be vigorous and effective. May we not hate each other. May peace, physical, mental, and spiritual, be on us forever. Om Sahasra Shirsham Devam Vishwaksham Vishwashambhuvam Vishwam Narayanam Devamaksharam Paramam Padam Vishwata Paramanityam Vishwam Narayanagum Harim Vishwame Vedam Purushastad Vishwamupajivati Patim Vishwasyatmeshwaragum Shashwatagum Shivamachyutam Narayanam Mahajneyam Vishwatmanam Parayanam. This universe is truly the divine personally. Therefore, it subsists on him, the self-effulgent divine being, who has many heads and many eyes, who is the producer of joy for the universe, who is the master and the cause of humanity, whose forms are the various gods, who is imperishable, who is the all-surpassing ruler and savior, who is superior to the world, who is endless and omniform, who is the goal of humanity, who is the destroyer of sin and ignorance, who is the protector of the universe and the ruler of individual souls, who is permanent, supremely auspicious and unchanging, who has embodied himself in man as his support, being the indwelling spirit, who is supremely worthy of being known by the creatures, who is embodied in the universe, and who is the supreme goal. Narayana Paro Jyotiratma Narayana Paraha Narayana Param Brahma Tattvam Narayana Paraha Narayana Paro Dhyata Dhyanam Narayana Paraha. Narayana is the supreme light described in the Upanishads. Narayana is the supreme reality designated as Brahman. Narayana is the highest self. Narayana is the infinite self. Narayana is the most excellent meditator and meditation. Yaccha kinchit jagat sarvam drishyate shruyate piva Antarbahishcha tat sarvam vyapya narayana sthitah. Whatsoever there is in this world, known through perception because of their proximity, or known through report because of their distance, all that is pervaded by Narayana within and without. Anandamavyayam kavigum samudrendam vishwashambhuvam padmakosha pratikasha hridayam chapyadhomukham. One should meditate upon the Supreme, the limitless, unchanging, all-knowing cause of happiness of the world, dwelling in the sea of one's own heart as the goal of all striving. The place for his meditation is the ether in the heart which is comparable to an inverted lotus bud. Adho nishtyavitasyande nabhyamuparitishthati jwalamala kulam bhati vishwasyayatanam mahat. It should be known that the heart which is located just at the distance of a finger span below the Adam's apple and above the navel is the great abode of the universe. Santatagum shilabhistu lambatya kosha sannibham tasyante sushiragum sukshmam tasmin sarvam pratishtitam. Like the bud of a lotus in an inverted position hangs the heart, surrounded by arteries. In it there is a narrow space, or near it there is a narrow space called Sushumna. In it everything is supported. Tasya madhye mahanagnir vishwarchir vishwato mukhaha Sograbho vibhajandishtannaha ramajara kavihi Tilya gordhamadashyayi rashmayastasya santataha Santapayate swam dehamapadatalamastatah Tasya madhye vannishikha aniyordha vyavasthitah Nilato yadamadhyastad vidyullekhe vabhasvara Nivarashukavatvanvi pidabha svatyanupama. In the middle of that narrow space of the heart, or Sushumna, remains the undecaying, all-knowing, omni-faced great fire, which has flames on every side, which enjoys the food presented before it, which remains assimilating the food consumed, the rays of which spread, scattering themselves vertically and horizontally, and which warms its own body from the insole to the crown. In the center of that fire, which permeates the whole body, there abides a tongue of fire of the color of shining gold, which is the topmost among the subtle, which is dazzling like the flash of the lightning that appears in the middle of a rain-bearing cloud, which is as slender as the awn of a paddy grain, and which serves as a comparison to illustrate subtlety. Tasya shikhaya madhye paramatma vyavasthitah Sabrahma Sashiva Sahari Sendra Sokshara Paramaswarat. Paramatman dwells in the middle of that flame. Although he is thus limited, still he is the four-faced creator, Shiva, Vishnu, Indra, the material and efficient cause of the universe, and the supreme, self-luminous, pure consciousness. Ritam Satyam Param Brahma Purusham Krishna Pingalam Udharetam Virupaksham Vishwarupaya Vai Namo Namaha. Supreme Brahman, the absolute reality, has become an androgynous person in the form of Uma Maheshwara, dark blue and reddish brown in hue, absolutely chaste and possessing uncommon eyes. Salutations to him, who alone is the soul of the universe. Om Narayanaya Vidmahe Vasudevaya Dhimahi Tanno Vishnu Prachodayat. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Hari Om Tat Sad. Shri Ram Krishna Paramastu. May we know Narayana, for that may we meditate on Vasudeva. May Vishnu impel us toward it. Om, peace, peace, peace.
Just to invite Shanker, Dr. Shanker Karunanithi, to come and join me up here. Device is working perfectly. Sorry, everybody, a bit of technical glitch. I swear this was working beautifully. Let me just try something here. Oh. Okay, somehow it was locked on the first slide. Who knows why? So as announced, the theme for our little panel of two is Vivekananda's groundbreaking ideas. And what we're doing is we're drawing on an article in this excellent book, Vivekananda as the Turning Point, the Rise of a New Spiritual Wave, which was brought out in 2013 as part of the celebrations for the 150th birth anniversary of Swami Vivekananda. So many eminent contributors to that book, including Gopal Stavig, and it's his article, Vivekananda's Groundbreaking Ideas, that we are tapping into for this panel. And just to introduce Dr. Shanker Karunanithi to you, he's the co-founder and CEO of the company Stress-Related Illness Solutions, a company developing therapeutics to treat heat-related illnesses. As you know, we're in a heating world, so that's very much needed. and we wish him all the best with that. And of course, he's a long time devotee of the Ramakrishna movement. He's a very close and dear friend to many of us. I'll get this going with the first point. The historical context to Vivekananda's groundbreaking ideas. Now, as many of you know, Vivekananda grew up in Calcutta at a time when it was the second most important city in the British Empire. It was the capital of India, and it was a real hotspot for all kinds of confusing things, in fact, because the British were seeking to anglicize the population and, in effect, create millions of loyal and cheap servants of their empire. They were at some sort of pinnacle at that time. So Narendra, the young Swami Vivekananda, grew up in a very confusing and really demoralizing time for the citizens of India. All their traditions were being challenged. But it's a scenario that the historian William Dalrymple describes as giving rise to unintended consequences. From his research, Dalrymple found numerous instances of British officials going native, so to say. And a standout example is Major General Charles Stewart. You see there, Hindu Stewart, he became known as. So, you know, a Major General, that's a pretty senior position he had. And he, after being in India for some time, became entranced by the culture, by the religion, so much so that he started writing books and articles extolling Hindu culture. He was urging his fellow Europeans stationed in India to adopt the dress of the locals. He would go to the Ganges each morning and do worship. And he also had a collection of Hindu deities. He even employed Brahmin priests to do worship, the daily worship of the deities for him. So very sincere and quite a standout character. The other one of note is Sir John Woodruff. Sorry, his name's a bit covered there. Sir John Woodruff was actually born in Calcutta. He had his education in the UK and came back to be a High Court judge in Calcutta. And in the course of his work there, he became closely entwined with the world of the Bengali intellectuals. And for those who know, at that time, West Bengal in particular, was a hotbed of producing a lot of particularly brilliant people at that time. He became fascinated by Indian philosophy. He, in fact, became an authority on Tantra. And he and his wife were initiated by a guru. And a friend describes how Woodruff's habit after a day in the courts would be he'd spend hours in meditation, bareheaded and semi-clothed in an attitude of yoga on the house roof. So that's how deeply he was going into the tradition, the culture, the practices. Very sincere person. Another unintended consequence of greater significance occurred when in a literature class by Professor William Hastie, exploring one of William Wordsworth's poems, in that the subject of trances arose. And that aroused the interest of one of Professor Hastie's favorite students, one Narendranath Dutta, the future Vivekananda. The professor, interestingly enough, had heard of a holy man called Ramakrishna, who was living nearby, who experienced these trances. And so he played an unwitting role in bringing about a meeting between the young Narendra and Sri Ramakrishna. And as most of us here would know, two figures that would ultimately play a leading role in the Indian Renaissance. Vivekananda and others were very well educated in the culture, philosophy, and history of their rulers. And so maybe ironically, they were very well equipped later to critique and compare it with their own culture. And this assisted in the modernizing of India's outlook, removing the dead wood from outmoded practices and grafting whatever was useful and relevant from the West. And that in turn led to an irresistible wave of pride and self-confidence in the populace, which in fact was then undermining the power of the colonizers. So now we're going to move on to the next section, the philosophy and the unity of Hinduism. And Dr. Karunanithi will lead on this one.
Pranams, or good morning, Matajis, devotees and friends. I'd like to first thank Gayatriprana ji and Robert for inviting me to participate in this discussion regarding Swami Vivekananda. Swami Vivekananda was a great and broad thinker, and he thought at a very grand level. Okay. And he thought on a very grand level in order to help humanity move forward. His philosophy had three themes that drove it. That's unity, synthesis, and integration. So these were the three themes that underlied his philosophy. And it's always curious to people to try and understand what were the factors that influenced him in order to come up with such a philosophy. One, it could be as a student at Presidency College at Calcutta, where he was exposed to both the Eastern and Western philosophical frameworks. Second, as Robert had already mentioned, he had Western teachers. Third, he had deep and profound spiritual experiences through his guru, Sri Ramakrishna. Four, he was as a wandering monk who wandered throughout India for years and years. He got a first-hand experience of the plight of the Indian people and their suffering that they were undergoing, and he was deeply moved by this. So these are some of the factors which might have conspired for him to develop this philosophy. And what you're going to be seeing is that these three themes will be underlying throughout this discussion, underlying his ideas, his teachings, as well as his activity. Oh, okay. Yeah, I'll just ask you. Now, one of the things that Swami Vivekananda did was he looked at the different characteristics of the different religions and tried to come up with ones that were helping to unify religious thought. And he discarded those that tended to promote differences. And let me illustrate that with this example here. So we have different colors representing the different characteristics of these religions. And where these different circles intersect, that small area pointed to by that arrow represents the common characteristics of all of these religions. And for some of these characteristics, for example, are peace, love, and compassion. And I'm sure many of you here would agree with me. These are very common characteristics of virtually every religion that exists at this point in time. So the exercise of all of this was to try and find common characteristics in order to unify humanity and discard those that produced differences and drove people apart. Next slide, Robin. One of Swami Vivekananda's central teachings was that man was not just made of body and mind, but he was pure, infinite spirit. And the goal of every living creature was to realize this intrinsic divinity. What separated man from animals and plant life was the degree, not the kind of divinity. So in this sense, what he was trying to do was trying to promote the idea that we were all part of a whole. And in order to understand this oneness, one needed to go beyond the ignorance that prevented us from recognizing this through spiritual practices. Oh, sorry. Oh, okay, I'm getting carried away. Sorry, people on Zoom. So with this idea, what you can see is that Swami Vivekananda was able to synthesize and integrate different concepts in order to show that we were part of the whole. Now, this didn't come about through just mere intellectual gymnastics, but through practical experiences that he gained through his intense spirituality. Next slide. Next slide. You know, another one of Swami Vivekananda's ideas tended to impact the concepts regarding science and spirituality, and this was one of his greatest contributions. At this point, we find that science and religion seem to be at loggerheads with one another. Sorry, I just got my slides all confused. So I was right. That's all right. Another one of the concepts that Swami Vivekananda tended to drive forth was the harmonious coexistence of opposites, that is, opposites in terms of ideas and viewpoints, that they are coexisting harmoniously rather than being antagonistic towards one another. And examples of these are Eastern thought versus Western thought. Traditional versus modern thinking, meditation versus activity, faith versus reason. For example, a simple example is when we think of light, we cannot conceive light without thinking of darkness. And when we think of darkness, we can't think about it without conceiving the concept of light. So what this helps us to understand is that both of these are there together. They're not in an antagonistic manner, but in a cohesive manner that tends to support one another. Now, the idea of the existence of opposites is not just pertinent to just Hinduism, but it's also seen in many of the other religions, such as Taoism. And this yin-yang figure that you see here, which is part of Taoism, tends to show that opposites can coexist with one another into the one. And essentially what Swami Vivekananda was trying to drive the idea is that we need to be accepting of differences, because these differences are really just part of the one. Next slide. As I mentioned briefly, that Swami Vivekananda's unifying concepts regarding science and religions, I believe, are one of the greatest contributions. Now, currently, science and religion seem to be at loggerheads with one another. When science is seen as a method to obtain or verify truth in the material world, but religion appears to be seen as a method that's actually trying to suppress truth And there are many factors that are responsible for this. And one could be some of the problems that are currently associated with the activities in the church. Now, when you think of religion, you don't automatically think of truth, do you? What you really automatically associate religion to is an emotional feeling. But what Swami Vivekananda said was that religion, like science, is trying to also verify truth, but a different kind of truth. And so let me try and explain that to you. So when we use science, what we are trying to do is verify truth on the material world. And the way that science works is that you first come up with an idea, and then you want to test this idea, whether it's true or false, by performing a series of experiments. So say, for example, you've developed a new medicine that's claiming that it's going to reduce blood pressure in order to treat people suffering from hypertension. So how would you test it? You will develop experiments and test that medicine on people suffering from hypertension to see if their blood pressure drops. If that is the case, you verified that this medicine works in the way that it was intended to do. And now you can use it to treat many other people. So that's how science works in the material world to verify truth. But how does it work in the spiritual world? If you conduct spiritual experiments, what are the outcomes that you're seeking? In a nutshell, what you're trying to do is, when you conduct these spiritual experiments, the truth that you're trying to verify is whether God really exists or not, okay? And in order to do this, what one needs to do is transcend above the realms of the body and mind in order to be able to seek this spiritual truth. But that's very difficult to do. I say it very simply, but it's very difficult to do. And that's why Sri Ramakrishna was able to do it, and that's why we revere him. What Sri Ramakrishna did is that he followed the different religious paths, such as Christianity and Islam. And what he reported was that irrespective of what religious path you took, it led you to God realization, and God really exists. So that's what that was the truth that he verified, at least on the spiritual level. Now, some of the differences between verifying truth using science and religions is somewhat centered on the way you communicate it. Now, when you're doing scientific experiments, you obtain results and conclusions, and you document these results and you can report it so everybody can read this. But when it comes to spirituality, it's a very different thing. The results and conclusions of your spiritual experiments cannot be reported to others. It's a highly personalized, individualized sort of experience. So because there's no language that's out there to help you translate what happens at the spiritual level to people at the material level. A comical way of thinking of it is, say, for example, I have to explain some of the complicated theories in nuclear physics to a bunch of accountants through dance. Does that work? It doesn't, does it? So that's what it's like. It's trying to explain something that doesn't work. There's no real language for it. So it's a great difficulty. So how do you know when you've actually found something positive? How do you know you got a good result when you're conducting these spiritual experiments? What people say is that if you have actually realized a spiritual truth, there's going to be a transformation in character. One is going to be more peaceful. One is more content and possibly wiser, but certainly not dumber. So that's something that you would supposed to be reported. Now, Swami Ranganathananda, who was one of the presidents of the order, what he said was that one has to pursue truth at both the material as well as the spiritual levels in order to get full contentment, in order to attain that fulfillment. If you pursued one at the expense of the other, it's somewhat unsatisfactory. So what we can say is Swami Vivekananda, what he did was he came up with a synthetic vision of both science and religion, providing a whole truth. And I believe that this idea of his was one of his greatest ideas. Next slide, please. Next, we move to the unity of Hinduism. And the next slide, please. Thanks. Now, when you look at Hinduism from the outside, it's highly diverse. There's different gods, different goddesses, different groups, different spiritual paths. So the question is there anything common that links all of this diverse sort of varieties that we see? Now, it's very easy to see a unifying theme when it comes to religions which have a single leader, such as Islam or Christianity. But in the case of Hinduism, because of this diversity, it's very difficult. So this is where Swami Vivekananda came in. And what he said was that despite all of these differences, the common theme that runs through all of these differences that we see in Hinduism lies with the fact that it's based on the teachings of the Upanishads as well as the Vedanta philosophy. And I have illustrated that with this simple diagram. So you can see there are groups who are practicing Advaitism, Shaivism, Vaishnavism, Krishna worship. All of these different groups have their foundational philosophical base that's rooted in the Upanishads and Vedanta philosophy. And at this point, I'd like to invite Robert to add to this.
Well, that's been fascinating, Karan. Wonderful, wonderful. We often hear of the grand unified theory of modern physics, where with the aim of unifying the electromagnetic weak and strong forces, merging them into a single force. But there's another grand unified theory, which was being touched on by Dr. Karunanithi, and that's proposed by Swami Vivekananda, where he's aiming to synthesize the three systems of Vedanta, that's dualism, qualified non-dualism, and non-dualism. There's the four yogas: karma yoga, the yoga of action; raja yoga, the science of psychic control and meditation; bhakti, devotional yoga; jnana, the yoga of knowledge. And then also incorporating into all of that elements from the 6 systems of Indian philosophy. So massive exercise that is, trying to bring about some unity with that. But Swamiji, in his words, he was striving for integration and not destruction, really taking the best from all of this, and to assimilate the old with the new, to reorientate ancient teachings and practices and make them more applicable to the modern world. So we may ask then, what's all that for us? What does that mean for us? How are we going to tap into that? And I think one of the simplest ways is this an approach of dipping into each of the 4 yogas each day as a way that we can directly relate to this and make use of it in our daily spiritual life. So, for example, we could start the day by sitting before our shrine, offering flowers, a little bit of chanting, sing a devotional song. These are all time-honored ways of expressing bhakti yoga, the yoga of devotion. That would create a peaceful and more concentrated atmosphere for our mind, and it would lead nicely then into meditation. That's where we're tapping into Raja Yoga, the science of psychic control. Afterwards, we could read some scriptures or spiritual books. So then we're delving into or making use of Jnana Yoga, the yoga of knowledge. Then after all of that, we're ready to launch into the day, off to work. So now Karma Yoga, the yoga of action, comes to the fore. So there's a very simple example of this unifying of the yogas, dipping into all of those. Of course, the trick is to get the most out of the four yogas. We shouldn't be focusing too much on any one of them. That can lead to a distorted and obsessive approach. And one Swami has a very humorous take on this. He says, too much of bhakti yoga, devotion, can make us sloppy. Too much of Raja yoga, the yoga of science, psychic control, can make us spooky. Too much of jnana yoga, the yoga of knowledge, can make us stony. And too much of karma yoga, if we're overly active, that makes us shaky. So the four S's: sloppy, spooky, stony, shaky. That's what we've got to avoid. So I think we're on to the next slide. Religious pluralism, next one. Now, again, to quote Swami Vivekananda, there is only one eternal transcendental religion. The religions of the world are not contradictory or antagonistic. They are but various phases of one eternal religion. There never was my religion or yours, my national religion or your national religion. There never existed many religions. There is only the one. One infinite religion existed for all eternity and will ever exist. And this religion is expressing itself in various countries in various ways. Therefore, we must respect all religions. So there's Swami Vivekananda's take of looking at religions in the deepest possible way. Swami Ranganathananda used to like describing two dimensions of religion: the ethnical and the spiritual. The ethnical dimension of religion is largely shaped by the history, culture, the geographic and climatic conditions under which the religion developed. Unavoidably, at that ethnical level, there are significant differences between each religion. From the deserts of the Middle East to the soaring mountains, dense jungles, and fertile plains of Asia, these diverse conditions give rise to diverse rituals, festivals, teachings, practices, and ways of honoring the divine. So that's all fine. Of course, the ethnical dimension, there will be a lot of difference. But then when we enter into the spiritual dimension, all these differences start to dissolve. Were they to meet, the saints and mystics of all the world faiths would exchange knowing looks, because they've had their experience of the peace that passeth understanding, and something that really they can't really put into words. No words can adequately describe that. So they would peaceably perhaps give knowing looks to each other. They've all had a glimpse or an experience of what lies beyond at the deepest levels of religion. For Vivekananda, it was quite natural that there be many paths to the divine. In fact, he encouraged that. But he said it was good to be born in a church, but he didn't want us to be confined there. That all these traditions and churches and temples and so on, they're nurturing us and they're helping to guide us on our way. And ultimately we go beyond them all. The clerics here, they have a rather humorous way of describing the supposedly religious people who are outwardly very formal in their religious observance. They call them four-wheelers because their first visit to the church is in a pram, second one for their christening, second one is in the limousine for their wedding, third one is in the hearse for their funeral. So there are a lot of people like that. They say, oh, yes, I'm religious and I belong to this particular religion, but they're just a four-wheeler in the eyes of some of the clerics. So now we're on to the next little section here. The founding of the Ramakrishna order. Kanan's going to lead on this one.
Next slide, please. Swami Vivekananda, when asked about what makes a robust religious movement, said that you need a couple of ingredients. And one of them is that you need a charismatic leader who has realized God or is worshipped as God, such as Jesus or Muhammad. And these charismatic leaders have somehow are able to convey these truths in a very convincing manner. Then what needs to occur is that these truths are documented in a book so that it can be passed on across one generation and also from generation to generation. So you have the Bible and the Quran that's able to do this. And then finally, another ingredient is actually the formation of an organization to spread the religious knowledge. And a good example of this is the Ramakrishna mission. So we have a charismatic leader, Sri Ramakrishna, who was able to realize these truths. And many of his ideas are in a number of books, but chiefly amongst them, the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. And there's also a movement, this Ramakrishna mission, that was formed 100 years ago to transmit this spiritual knowledge. And what I will do now is pass it on to Robert to go into more detail regarding this.
Well, I'm just going to touch on how you have these significant moments in history that for someone we can't always anticipate the ultimate results of a meeting, for example. So you had this first meeting between Vivekananda, then Narendranath Datta. His first meeting with Sri Ramakrishna in the house of a devotee in Calcutta in November in 1881. And if you think about it, the significance of that meeting is still unfolding today. And it's a meeting that's linked inextricably to the rise of India as a superpower. And that's not making any exaggeration at all, because Sri Ramakrishna inspired Vivekananda. And as we know, Vivekananda's teachings, subsequent teachings, have inspired and instructed many of the leading figures in India and other leading figures in Asia and beyond. And what I sometimes reflect on, imagine for a casual, critical observer to that meeting. As we know, many people viewed Sri Ramakrishna as this mad priest of Dakshineswar. And the idea that he could have some influence on world history would be ludicrous. On the surface, he appeared as nothing more than a simple, tottering, absent-minded priest. But then those who sat at his feet in his little room at the Kali temple in Dakshineswar, they, of course, got glimpses behind that facade. They had direct experience of this irresistible power, a blazing fire of truth and wisdom. So, of course, they understood what they were sitting before and what the potential was. And as we know from Sri Ramakrishna, Swami Vivekananda caught the hint of a need for a new direction in how Hinduism is practiced, or in particular how Hindu monasticism is practiced, where combining the deepest spiritual life, the monastics should also get very actively engaged in social service. Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda, between them, have played a major role in bringing that about in modern Hinduism. And of course, we know all the big organizations are doing that now. And then, of course, there was the other power, more subtle maybe, the Holy Mother present and guiding things. The Ramakrishna mission was founded on the 1st of May 1897. And if you do look at the yearly statistics, how many people are served and in how many ways, both by Ramakrishna mission and since many decades now, the Sri Sarada mission, you've got countless millions upon millions of people who have benefited with education, health and relief and so on. Tremendous. And also then now it has such a strong international presence, and so spiritually people are being benefited a great deal by the Ramakrishna order. So now I think we can move on to the next little section. It's locking up again on this.
Yes, that's it. Okay, now educating the poor and raising the status of women was not something new at that time when Swami Vivekananda was around. But what is unique about Swami Vivekananda's contribution was that he placed these on a spiritual foundation. And what he said is that serving the poor is like serving God, because each soul is potentially divine. Furthermore, he viewed women and men as Atman, that is, since they have the same conscious self that is binding people together in all beings, actually. So he wanted to root out discrimination based on gender. Now, what we can see here again is that Swami Vivekananda is trying to unify humanity, not in terms of both gender and class. And the reason for that is because we all have this underlying unity that's linking all of us together. And at this point, I like to hand it over to Robert.
So to quote Swami Vivekananda, he recognized that each nation has a destiny to fulfill. Each nation has a message to deliver. Each nation has a mission to accomplish and contribute to the harmony of races. So we know, I'll go to the next slide if we can get it to work. Technology, okay. Whereas India's speciality, as we know, has been religion and spirituality, I've been ruminating on this and wondering, well, what does Australia have to offer the world? Australia is a unique place. It's the oldest, flattest, driest continent on Earth. And it's home to the oldest and newest communities on Earth as well. And most of the population, as we're all huddled here on the East Coast. And there's this vast, harsh, sparsely populated outback. And if you look at Australia through the eyes of people from Europe and Asia, that is intriguing to them. This vast area to the west of us. So we have wealth, we have space, we have opportunities. So if Vivekananda were to visit us now, I'm sure he'd admire our healthy, vigorous approach to life. He would note our openness to new ideas. We're very quick adopters of any new technology by world standards, for example, where we've got a very practical nature. But then perhaps he may also wish that we learn from the original inhabitants, for whom this land is more a sacred ground than just a fun-seeking playground. Perhaps we could try to tap into their view of time, which I've been reading about, and it's not easy to grasp, but as far as I've understood, for the First Nations people, time comes together, the past, present, and the future, they bring together in what they call the dreaming. And for them, the dreaming is the ground of existence, a sacred past and the present. I mean, the past is more present to them than maybe what it is to us. And furthermore, they have a habit of whatever changes are taking place now, they very strongly get incorporated into their present as well. And of course, then they have an unusual concept of the future. It's like the future is here now as well. Wandering over this continent over millennia, they experienced a really deep connection. For them, their ancestors are very present with them. And of course, the tribe they're in occupies such an important part of their world. Then, of course, the plants, the animals, and the land, everything. Very, very strong awareness of that, and they're very strongly enmeshed in that. So, in other words, they've got a very strong connection with time and place, perhaps stronger than what we have. Now, this ancient rock monolith, Uluru, is of course an especially sacred place for them. And I think we should all view it as a sacred place. I mean, we don't have ancient temples and other places of worship. The new society that's come here, we're still too young. But then there are ancient sacred places here, and they're in the form of monoliths like Uluru. And I wonder whether Swami Vivekananda might encourage us to form a closer link, we comparative newcomers to this country, with those places. Many of you, I'm sure, have been out there. I went out there some years ago with Mataji in a little group, and I was musing about it while I was there, that it's one of the places on earth where you're the furthest away from any air pollution, for one. So if you look around, the blueness of the sky is a blue that you would never have seen before. It's quite striking. And the color of the soil, such a beautiful ochre color. I mean, it's, for anyone with any sort of artistic inclination, it's a stunning landscape. While we were there, we went also to Katata Juta, which is a group of dome-shaped rocks, a short drive from Uluru. And when we went there late in the afternoon, and all the tourist buses and the day trippers were leaving as we were walking in. And a little group of us sat there for meditation. And I can never forget that. In that, I think without trying very hard, you could feel this ancient, timeless, brooding silence there. Quite an experience. And I think the closest you can come to that here, we have our retreat place at Dharma. And we've got a place where we sit and meditate at the escarpment overlooking the Upper Kangaroo Valley. And there you get that same sort of sense of timelessness. So I'm just imagining the First Nations people before we came, and that silence that was here, what an impact that would have on them, on their outlook. So then, just to conclude, we know we've had various waves of migrants arrive here, and with them has come an opportunity for them to share the best of their historical and cultural backgrounds. So through that, we're creating a fresh new culture here. And as revered Gayatriprana Mataji used to say, the many cultures that have settled here aren't held back by any outmoded constraints or prejudices of their home countries. They're able, if they wish, to live a fresh, expanded, modern version of their backgrounds. So perhaps that might be Australia's contribution over time, a place of cultural reset, drawing on the ancient and the new, and an altered, wiser sense of time and place and what lies beyond. So with that, we conclude our panel, and thanks very much, Kanan, for participating. We will now move on to the next item in the program with a talk by Pravrajika Gayatriprana. And we'll just get set up with that.
Thank you, Robert and Shanker, for the nice panel discussion. We got a lot of insights. The topic for my talk is Swami Vivekananda, the eminent yogi. Dhyayet Narayanam Swami Vivekananda Rupinam Veresharat Samutpannam Saptarshi Puradagadam Dhyana Nimakna Murtim Cha Patmaksha Gaura Vigraham Jodi Punjam Samashritya Loka Kalyana Karinam. I meditate on Narayana in the form of Swami Vivekananda, born of Vireshwara Shiva. He came down from the realm of 7 sages and is always immersed in meditation. With eyes beautiful like the lotus petals and of fair complexion, he has assumed a luminous form for bringing about the welfare of the world. We go back to the early part of 1886. Sri Ramakrishna was suffering from the throat cancer. So he was brought to Kasipur for treatment. And Narendra and the other young disciples, they have realized there's not much time for the master to be on earth, so they're practicing meditation. We are going to that time. One day, Narendra and another disciple was meditating in the hall one evening, when suddenly Narendra felt as if a lamp had been lit behind his head, and the light grew in intensity until it seemed that the lamp itself burst, and he lost all consciousness, even of the body. He remained in that state for quite some time, lost to external world completely, plunged deep into samadhi. After some time, when he regained partial consciousness, he became conscious of his body, but he couldn't find his body. So he started shouting, "Where is my body? Where is my body?" The disciple who was sitting next to him said, "Why, it's here. Can't you feel it?" But he couldn't feel his body. He kept on shouting, "Where is my body?" And the disciple who was sitting next to him, was known as Elder Gopal, he ran upstairs to Sri Ramakrishna, saying that Naren is shouting, asking for his body, he is going to die. Sri Ramakrishna was not perturbed. He said, let him remain in that state. He has been pestering me for a long time, quite some time for this. Realizing that Sri Ramakrishna's body won't last for long, much longer time, Narendra and other disciples intensified their spiritual practices. And he had many experiences, spiritual experiences. He had many visions. In the gospel, you can see Narendra telling how many visions of gods and goddesses, how many mantras, in shining mantras in golden letters, but I don't have peace. He, in spite of all his experiences, he didn't have peace because he was striving for the highest. His aim was the highest realization of Brahman. So he pleaded with Sri Ramakrishna. He's saying that all have succeeded. Shall I alone remain unsatisfied? So Sri Ramakrishna consoled him, saying, oh, it will happen in time. Another time he said, why don't you settle your family matters? Because at that time, his father had passed away and the family was in dire financial difficulties. They were almost starving, to say. So Sri Ramakrishna said that, why don't you finish that? Then another time he asked, what do you want? Narendra said, I want to remain immersed in samadhi, once in a while coming out just to eat some food to keep the body going. Hearing that answer, Sri Ramakrishna said, what a small-minded person you are. We may finding it surprise to remain immersed in samadhi. Sri Ramakrishna saying it's a small-minded person. There's a state higher than that, higher than samadhi. He wanted a state higher than samadhi. And another time Sri Ramakrishna said, I thought you would be like a huge banyan tree giving shelter to thousands of weary people who are lost their directions, who are driven by endless sense cravings, leading them to frustration, despair, and suffering. So Sri Ramakrishna did not want Narendra to remain immersed in samadhi. If it happened, then the world would have missed the guidance of a self-realized teacher. So he wanted Narendra to work for humanity. And he wanted Narendra to see the presence of God in all the whole universe and everything that exists in it, and serve humanity as such. It was after a few days that Narendra had this experience of Nirvikalpa Samadhi, the highest realization. To quote Swami Tejasananda from his book, Swami Vivekananda, his message, one evening, unexpectedly, the mind of Narendra soared high up into the indefinable stillness of the Absolute, wherein space vanishes into nothingness. Time is swallowed up in eternity, and causation becomes a dream of the past, a state in which the knowledge, known and knower, become one indivisible consciousness, and the self, shattering the prison of matter, merges in the infinite glory of Brahman. This experience of Nirvikalpa Samadhi, going beyond body consciousness, the Upanishads speaks in this term. Vidyade hriday granthis chidyande sarva samshayaha shiyande chasya karmani tasmin drishte paravare. The fetters of the heart are broken, all doubts are resolved, and all work cease to bear fruit when he, that's Brahman, is beheld, who is both high and low. That's the experience that Narendra had. So After quite some time, he regained full consciousness of the outer world, and he felt bathed in peace and bliss. So he went upstairs to Sri Ramakrishna, and Sri Ramakrishna, when he saluted, he said, "Now Mother has shown you everything. But this realization shall be shut up like a jewel in a box, and I will keep the key. After you have finished Mother's work, the box will be unlocked and you will know everything again." So he had this experience, but Sri Ramakrishna is not going to allow him to remain immersed in that. He said, this experience will be locked up and the key will be with me. So you can't get the experience unless I allow. So that's the idea. But he said, you have to work, you have got work to do. Once you finish your work, then it will be unlocked. Later, he told the other disciples, when Naren knows who he really is, he will refuse to stay on earth. I have prayed to Mother to keep the knowledge of the Absolute away from him and cover his eyes with the veil of Maya, for he has so much work to do. See, us ordinary people, we are trying to get over Maya. And here, Sri Ramakrishna is purposely putting some Maya over Narendra so that he will remain in the world. But the veil is so thin that it may be torn at any moment. The veil of Maya is so thin, it may be torn at any moment. And we know of a few instances when Swami Vivekananda was in the West, that the veil of Maya was about to be torn. The first one we can speak of happened in 1895. Swami Vivekananda had been giving talks and lectures in New York for quite some time, intense, giving 8-10 talks and classes a week for quite a few weeks. And he was very, very tired. At that time, one of the attendees of the class, Mr. Francis Leggett, invited Swamiji to his fishing camp, Camp Percy, for a holiday. And Swamiji accepted it. There, Mr. Leggett and Miss MacLeod and her sister Betty, Mr. Leggett married Betty Struggles. There were few of them, and Miss MacLeod, who always claimed to be a friend of Swamiji. She's very close to Swamiji, and she describes what happened one day there. One day, she says, one morning before breakfast, Swamiji came out of his room with his Bhagavad Gita, and seeing Miss MacLeod, he said, "Joe, I'm going to sit under that pine tree," pointing to pine tree close by, "and read my Bhagavad Gita. See that the breakfast is sumptuous today," in a very light mood. And after half an hour or so, when Miss MacLeod went to call Swamiji, she found Swamiji sitting under the tree motionless. The Gita had fallen from his hands. The front of his robe was wet with tears. To quote her description, "I went nearer and saw that his breathing had stopped altogether. I trembled in fear. Swamiji must be dead. I did not shout, but ran to Francis Leggett and told him, 'Come quick, Swami Vivekananda has left us.' My sister ran to the spot with loud cries, and my future brother-in-law, Mr. Leggett, also came with tears in his eyes. By the time another 7 or 8 minutes had gone, Swamiji was still in the same position. But my brother-in-law said, He is in a trance. I'll shake him out of it. I stopped him, shouting, never do that. I remembered that Swamiji had said once that when he would be in deep meditation, one should not touch him. Another 5 minutes or so passed. See, it's a long time. Then we saw signs of breathing. His eyes had been half closed. Now slowly they opened. And then Swamiji said to himself, who am I? Where am I? Thrice he spoke like that. And then wide awake, he saw us, was very much embarrassed, and stood up and said, I'm sorry to have frightened you all. He's back to his normal plane. I shall not leave my body in your country. Then another incident that we know of happened in the same year, just a few weeks after that, I should say. From Camp Percy, Swamiji went to Thousand Island Parks. A few of the students who attended Swamiji's lectures in New York wanted him to continue the classes and talks, even through summer. The people had all left the city, but one of the students, Miss Dutcher, had a cottage in Thousand Island Park. So she invited Swamiji. And Swamiji said, if anybody is ready to travel all the way up on the Hudson River, I'll teach you. So few of them went there, and Swamiji, living there in Miss Dutcher's cottage, got intimate contact with Swamiji. For 7 weeks, Swamiji taught them. Imagine living in his presence, day and night for 7 weeks. It's an unforgettable experience. And Swamiji later said he was the best in those 7 weeks. Fortunately, we have got some of his teachings noted by one of the ladies who attended, Miss Waldo, and it has come out as the inspired talks. He was in an inspired mood. Just like when Sri Krishna delivered the teachings of the Gita in a state of yoga, Swamiji was in an inspired mood. But it's only part of the teachings, only when he formally took the class. But all the time, even on the dining table, breakfast time or lunch, or while they are walking in the evening, always Swamiji is giving spirituality, even in his jokes, everything. But they are all not there, but at least we have got some of his teachings. On the last day, Swamiji took 2 of them for a walk, because those 2 came late. They came all the way from Detroit. They were late, and late means a few weeks later they came. So Swamiji took Christina Greenstidel and Mary Funk. They went for a walk, and they thought Swamiji will be giving some teachings or instructions. Instead, Swamiji said, let's meditate. So under a tree, they sat down, and soon Swamiji was immersed. He was lost to the world. Then suddenly there was a thunderstorm. It poured. They were not prepared. But Miss Mary Funk had an umbrella. She opened the umbrella and stood there, but Swamiji was completely unconscious. He was not at all aware of the rain and a thunderstorm. Quite some time passed. After, then they could hear the shouting, and people from the camp, they came running with the raincoats and umbrellas. And slowly Swamiji regained consciousness. And then he looked around and said, oh, I'm back in Calcutta in the rain. He had gone back. He was absorbed in meditation. He was, in both times, we can say, he was called back from merging himself into the infinite by the presence of others. There's a third occasion that happened on the shores of Lake Michigan. He was about to be merged in the Brahman when he had a vision of Sri Ramakrishna. Sri Ramakrishna appeared before him and reminded him about the work he has to do. How many other times, we don't know. Because he never liked to talk about of his experiences. But these few instances show that samadhi was a natural state for him. But there's nothing to be surprised at when you realize that Sri Ramakrishna had a vision of him as one of the 7 sages. Sri Ramakrishna later described his devotees. One day he was sitting in meditation, his mind soared along a luminous path. It left the material world, soaring high in samadhi, went past the subtle regions of ideas, and then the region where there's a forms of gods and goddesses, went past that. The mind then reached the outer limits of the region where a luminous barrier separated the sphere of the relative from the absolute. Then the mind crossed the barrier and went to the plane where it's only the absolute reality. But suddenly he was surprised to see 7 sages immersed in samadhi there. He was surprised. Then how great these will be, how much greater than all the gods and goddesses beyond they are beyond the relative plane. As he was pondering about the greatness of these sages, he saw that luminous consciousness, part of it condensed and took the form of a little child. And the child went to one of the sages and put its hands around the sage's neck. At the touch of the child, the sage opened his eyes. And from the look on the sage's face, you can see that was the child was the object of his meditation. And then what did the child do? The child said, I'm going down. You too must go with me. The sage just looked at the child, and then Sri Ramakrishna says, I saw a part of his body and mind descending to earth on a luminous path. Then the sage closed his eyes and went back to meditation. And later he said, when I saw Narendra, I recognized him as that sage. So Narendra is a sage adept in meditation. Sri Ramakrishna referred to him as Dhyana Siddha, adept in meditation. And his proficiency in meditation can be seen from his childhood. As a young boy, one of his favorite games was to play at meditation. He and his friends, other boys, will sit for meditation. That is his play. One day, they all sat for meditation, and Narendra was soon lost to outer consciousness. The other boys were sitting there fidgeting, wondering how long will Narendra sit. When they saw a cobra crawling in front and coming to them, they all got frightened and ran off and ran to call the elders. And the elders came running, and there Narendra is still steeped in meditation. He had no idea what's happening. And then the cobra went away, but that showed he was, from childhood, he was adept in meditation. And once, soon after, a few visits after his coming to Sri Ramakrishna, one day Sri Ramakrishna asked, do you see a light between your eyes before you go to sleep? He said, yes. That was one of the usual thing. When he went to bed at night, just before falling asleep, he used to see a luminous point of light between his eyebrows. And it was such a pleasing thing that he used to watch it, that luminous point. Sitting on his bed, he will watch that. Slowly, slowly, that luminous point will grow in size till it became like a big ball. And then it will burst and into a liquid white light covering him from head to foot, and he'll fall asleep. He thought that's how people fall asleep. Only much later, one day when he was talking to his friends, He asked them, do you see the light point of light when you go to sleep? They said, no. Oh, so only then he realized it is something special for him, unique for him. And when Sri Ramakrishna asked this question and he said yes, then it was confirmed. That happens. That's a sign of a advanced yogi. Yoga, the word comes from the root yuj, to unite. Unite with God or the supreme soul or reality. Yoga is also used as the means to reach that reality. So as we already heard in the discussion, there's 4 yogas. Yoga of action, devotion, psychic control, and knowledge. And each one we can have depending upon our temperament, proficient in one. But they are not watertight compartments, as Robert was saying. In the whole day we can practice all the 4 yogas different time. They are all mixed with each other. So Swami Vivekananda says, to become harmoniously balanced in all these 4 directions is my ideal of religion, harmoniously balanced. And his life is a glowing example of the harmonious blending of the 4 yogas. One of the definitions of yoga that given in the Bhagavad Gita is, yoga is that state in which the mind is restrained by the practice of concentration, in which, seeing the self by the self, one enjoys transcendental bliss and remain unaffected by the greatest pain. A true yogi has such perfect control over his mind and can concentrate on any object. He can also withdraw his mind from that object at his will. We see that this man trait in young Narendra from the boyhood. Narendra was being homeschooled. The private tutor used to come and teach him. When the tutor was reading out to him and explained whatever the lesson is, Narendra would close his eyes and sit motionless. Or sometimes he would lie down on the floor. One day the tutor got so annoyed that he rudely shook him to arouse him as though he was from sleeping. Narendra opened his eyes and without answering or giving any answer to the angry words of the tutor, he just recited verbatim the whole text that was read in the preceding hour. So that shows his concentration. He was apparently not listening, but he absorbed everything. In later life, we can see that concentration he used for his meditation. Patanjali gives the 8 limbs of yoga. Yama, that is non-violence, truthfulness, non-stealing, chastity, and non-receiving of gifts. Niyama, austerity, purity, contentment, self-study, and surrender to God. Then there is posture, breath control, and pratyahara, that's control of the senses from their objects. These 5 steps are external and preparatory. The next 3 steps, dharana, dhyana, and samadhi, are internal, and they are the actual practice of controlling the thought waves. Dharana is holding the mind on one point. Dhyana is continuing holding the mind in that one point. So that stage, the mind flows in a constant, unbroken stream towards that point of meditation. And when dhyana gets intensified, that culminates in samadhi. So we can say young Narendra, with strong concentration, was at the stage of dharana. So he has only the last 2 steps, dhyana and samadhi, to climb up. Well, if you say Swami Vivekananda, is one of the 7 stages, came down to the earth. Why do we say that he has to climb the last 2 steps of dhyana and dharana, dhyana and samadhi? Having taken a human form, he need to set an example to people how to struggle towards the highest goal. We see Sri Ramakrishna practice spiritual disciplines for 12 long years. If you believe that Sri Ramakrishna is an incarnation of God, God taken a human form, what is the need for all those spiritual practices? To set an example and to show that you have to struggle for God realization. Without struggle, nothing happens. And talking about Narendra and other young disciples like Rakhal, Sri Ramakrishna compared them to the Homa bird. In the Vedas, they speak about the Homa bird. It is said that this bird lives very high up in the sky. There it lays the egg. So up in the sky, the egg falls. It is so high that as the egg keeps on falling, it hatches and the chick comes out. Then it opens its eyes. And as soon as the little bird realizes that it is falling down, it realizes that once it hits the ground, it will be dashed to pieces. So straight away goes back up towards, fly up back to its mother up in the sky. So that's Homa bird. Narendra, Raghal, and some of those young disciples are like that. In the early days of early youth, they may have to do some spiritual practices to go back to their natural abode. So under Sri Ramakrishna's guidance, Narendra was able to climb those 2 steps and, as we are saying, attain the highest state of Nirvikalpa Samadhi. So even though these instances of Nirvikalpa Samadhi that are known to us are only few, but that's not guarantee that he didn't experience other times. He is known to have lived most of the time on the threshold of the infinite, whether he was in the West or after his return to India. The Life of Swami Vivekananda, the book by Eastern and Western disciples, says, one sees him in his New York retreat in the morning or in the evening quiet or at dead of night meditating. Oftentimes he was lost in meditation, his unconsciousness of the external betraying his complete absorption within. While he was teaching his students in New York or in other places also, how to concentrate the mind and meditate, he'll be sitting cross-legged. Often, as he was explaining and showing them how to meditate, he will be plunged into meditation. And the meditation is just preparatory to this, his class or lecture, but he will be so much absorbed in meditation, he'll be lost to the world. And sometimes half an hour, 45 minutes will go before he comes out of it. Sometimes even then he won't happen. He won't regain consciousness. So to avoid such embarrassment, he instructed 1 or 2 of his students as to how to bring his mind back. When we read that, we remember how Sri Ramakrishna used to tell, always chant some name of God to bring his mind back to the normal consciousness. That Swamiji did the same thing. He taught a few of the students to utter some mantra to bring his mind back to the normal consciousness. In his early days in America, while traveling by tram car, it was often happen event that he'll be carried away by meditation and the tram car will be going round and round each time, few times on the route. Each time, the only disturbance was the conductor coming and asking for the fare. And it was so embarrassing for Swamiji that he tried his best not to go into such moods, but it happened not. The moment he sits down, his mind gets absorbed. Even on his return to India, it happened, you see. He was given a grand reception, a conquering hero's welcome by the whole nation in 1897. In the midst of such hectic activities, we see him again going into Samadhi. He was noticed to enter into Samadhi for short periods of time. In 1897, he was in what's now Chennai, Madras, for 9 days. He stayed in Castle Kernan, or what's now known as Vivekananda Illam. We have a description of those reminiscence by one of those people who attended his conversation and while he was there, Professor Sundar Ramayya. He wrote it as My Navaratri with Swami Vivekananda. 9 days, so he's called his retreat as My Navaratris with Swami Vivekananda. He wrote, although Swamiji was always having visitors about him and sat listening and speaking to them, his eyes would suddenly become still, though remaining open. His eyes opened, but become still, and he seemed not to listen or even be conscious of what was passing about him. He seemed like one who, for a short while, had left his physical tenement and fleeted away to another state of existence. These brief absorptions in Samadhi was noticed even by his brother disciples, Swami Shivananda and Swami Niranjanananda. They had gone to Madras to welcome him, to meet him when he came back. They also noticed this. And later, years later, Swami Shivananda remarked that ever since Swamiji returned from the West in 1897, he had dwelt in a continuous state of superconsciousness. In 1899, Swamiji went to the West a second time. This time he spent most of his time in California. And the people were already heard about him, read his book, Raj Yoga. All were those he had given the talks and written the book Raj Yoga. So they were already available. They had read it. And Swamiji gave a few lectures on psychic control, mind control, all that. So there was a great demand for personal instruction. The students who attended the lectures wanted personal instruction. So Swamiji said those who are ready to come to the flat where he was living in 1719 Turk Street in San Francisco, he said, I'm happy to teach you. So personal instruction. Imagine how the good fortune of those few people who went for classes with Swamiji. The classes began with a meditation of 15 to 30 minutes, and then he gave the instructions. All those lectures that Swamiji and the classes that he gave in San Francisco, we got some of them. There was no Mr. Goodwin to record all the lectures as happened during his first visit, who was a professional stenographer who could write down everything what Swamiji said. But luckily, the divine brings somebody to take note. So there was one Mr. Frank Rodhamel who wrote down some in shorthand some of his classes and talks, and then one Ida Hansel, she also noted down. But Swamiji's ideas are so new to them, and his way of explaining is so fascinating. Sometimes they were carried away by listening that they forget to note down what he's speaking. Still, we have got some. One of those people to meditate with Swamiji was an unforgettable experience. One person who attended his meditation classes later wrote, the Swami became completely lost to the external world. His presence seemed to radiate divine influence, which permeated our very being. If we went home, our feet scarcely touching the ground. It seemed as if the Swami had given us to drink of the divine nectar. Swamiji stayed in Turk Street flat for almost 7 weeks. Actually 46 days he stayed there. And he gave 61 talks or classes in these 46 days, non-stop, on and on. And as I said earlier, Frank Rodhamel attended most of these talks, and that's how we have got some of his classes. He wrote about, he commented, he is a yogi indeed, awake only to transcendental thought. He was the ideal, compelling veneration, love, and devotion. As the supreme yogi, Swamiji could transmit spirituality by a touch or by a look. Sitting with him while he meditated, the mind naturally got concentrated and elevated to the higher level. In Alameda, one day, Alice Hansbrough, who was acting as Swamiji's housekeeper, secretary, she was upset about something. So Swamiji said, come and meditate with me. She said, no, Swami, I don't meditate. Swamiji said, all right, come and sit next to me. I'll meditate. So what happened next? Alice Hansbrough related. So I sat down and closed my eyes. In a moment, I felt as though I were going to float away. And I quickly opened my eyes to look at Swamiji. He had the appearance of a statue, as though there was not a spark of life in his body. He was completely absorbed, deep in meditation. And the person who is sitting, because she sat next to him, her mind was elevated to such a high level. And his magic touch would calm the mind of all disturbing thoughts and raise the mind to a higher level of agnostics or even crying babies. There's one incident. While he was going in India around as a wandering monk, he was in Maharashtra. The host with whom he was staying had a baby who was crying the whole night. So after 1 or 2 days, seeing this baby crying the whole night, Swamiji told the host, give me the baby. Then they said, no, but Swamiji, you can't sleep, you can't meditate, he'll be crying all the whole night. He said, no, let me see. So he sat down with cross-legged. They put the baby on his lap and he meditated the whole night and the baby slept the whole night. The vibration from the spiritual vibration from him was such that whatever was disturbing the baby was lulled and it had a good sleep. So powerful were the spiritual vibrations coming from him. He brought his mind down to the ordinary plane by his tremendous willpower to accomplish the mission for which he had taken a human form. And what was his mission? In his own words, my ideal indeed can be put into a few words. And that is to preach unto mankind their divinity and how to manifest in every moment of life. To preach unto mankind their divinity and how to make it manifest in every moment of life. He is still working. We don't say we say Swamiji left his body, but that doesn't mean that he has stopped working. He's still working to help humanity on our spiritual journey. Because we see him saying, it may be good that I leave this body like a cast of worn-out garment, but I will not cease to work until the world knows that it is one with God. That is Swamiji's mission, and we pray that he help us to realize our divine nature. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for attending our celebration. We are in summer recess, so some of our regular activities will only recommence next month. But in the meantime, the nuns will be coming here the next 2 Sundays for spiritual reading and silent meditation from 11 a.m. to 12 noon. So you're always welcome to join them. We'll keep you informed about the upcoming special events. Of course, we've got Sri Ramakrishna's birthday celebration coming up next month and Shivaratri. So our weekly email will keep you up to date on information about that. And have donation plate and donation box. And now you're invited to stay back and join us for lunch, which will be served out the back.